All right, so in this final module for the course, we are going to talk about the politics of voting and the politics of elections. We're going to start out here with the politics of voting, right? I'm going to say the obvious here. In a constitutional democracy, voting is absolutely central, right? And when we think about that democratic ethos, right, at the center of that ethos is popular sovereignty, right? Power to the people. And what's a key way to empower we the people, right? Universal adult suffrage. Let's start there. All right, so we'll start at the beginning here, as we often do. What do we know about suffrage at the founding of the American Republic? Well, heck, we've talked about this. Historians estimate that around 5 or 6% of us could vote after we ratified the Constitution and got it up and running, i.e., in this case, white men with significant property. Now that began to change, as we've discussed, as early as the aftermath of the election of 1800, where the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans narrowly defeated the Federalists. And with that, right, because Jefferson was an advocate of an expanded suffrage, we started to expand suffrage in the aftermath of that election. Initially expanding that suffrage to white men with either lower amounts of property or with no property at all. What a radical concept. Back then it was. Black men were guaranteed the right to vote in the aftermath of the Civil War through the 15th Amendment, as we've discussed, in 1870. Now, what we know about that, right, is that was enforced during Reconstruction, but Reconstruction failed after about a dozen years. Right, this guarantee of the right to vote for black men, but certainly not black women or women at all, right? It's not actually realized except for a brief interlude, sadly, and then we go backwards again, right? The rise of Jim Crow, the KKK, and all of that. Women were guaranteed the right to vote in 1920 through a constitutional amendment, of course, through the suffrage movement. Black Americans finally guaranteed the right to vote in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And those 18 and older were guaranteed the right to vote in 1971 through a constitutional amendment. And ever since then, we've effectively had universal adult suffrage, except, right, it turns out that we still exclude, depending on what state you live in, we still exclude a chunk of the adult citizens in America, those who are either felons currently incarcerated or those who are ex-felons. And generally speaking, you're not going to find this to be surprising at all. The more conservative the state, the more likely they are to bar ex-felons from voting. Almost all states ban current felons from voting, except for I think maybe 2. And once you get to ex-felons, right, the more conservative states will ban them and the more liberal states will not. And think about it, right? There's going to be a racially disproportionate impact of those policies, right? We haven't gotten into that here. This is an introductory course. It's not an advanced course on criminal justice. But if it were, we would know that disproportionately our incarcerated population is disproportionately black by quite a margin. It's actually shocking, and not in a good way. So when you do disenfranchise ex-felons, you're systematically mostly disenfranchising black men, to put it bluntly. I know that just a few years ago down in Florida, we the people had voted on a ballot measure to automatically re-enfranchise an ex-felon, right? That once they became an ex-felon, they would again regain the right to vote. That was the ballot measure, but it was worded fairly loosely. And under the leadership, I believe at the time of Governor Ron DeSantis, early days of his tenure there as governor, the legislature, I think, got too clever by half and defined, what does it mean to be an ex-felon? Have you paid all of your fines and restitution? Have you paid for your incarceration in all the jurisdictions where you were convicted of crimes? They came up with a very stringent definition of what constitutes being an ex-felon. And because, right, most ex-felons have essentially no money and no particular job prospects, the ability to pay for your incarceration and to pay restitution to your victims is often out of reach, right? So although I think the ballot measure was meant to re-enfranchise these people, the legislature said, screw that. You know, quite honestly, I'll be blunt here. This is a Republican-dominated legislature led by a Republican governor. And their view, I think, was these ex-felons, you know, do they really deserve to vote, to get the vote back again? And most of them are black men. You know, they're not going to vote Republican. Why would we allow them access to the ballot? So they've made sure that for the most part, that ballot measure has been meaningless. So that's the way that went down in Florida some years ago. Also true, right, that we've seen more broadly a push in states with a Republican trifecta, i.e. Republicans control of the governor's office and the state legislature, both houses. There's been a pretty hard push, right, to limit access to the ballot through, we'll see momentarily, what are called administrative burdens, right? Erect as many administrative burdens as possible in the name of election integrity to make it more difficult to gain access to the ballot. And we've seen that play out, right, with the pandemic, right? There was an expansion of access to the ballot through mail-in voting, right? In some states like Nevada, that ballot mailed to everyone who's registered to vote. And that has increased turnout significantly in the last few election cycles. For a political scientist, that's exciting. We're like, yay, the more turnout, the better. Right, but Republicans have seen that as counter to their interests. There's no evidence that it is. The evidence is that when you expand access to the ballot, both parties benefit. General turnout goes up, you know. So it seems to be party neutral in impact. But the conception here by the Republicans is if you expand access to suffrage, that's bad for Republicans. It's not, but that's the belief, and beliefs are what drive politics. And you've seen, right, within the Republican Party, this intense internecine battle over exactly this question of, all right, access to the ballot was expanded during the pandemic. Should we continue with those expanded forms of access, or should we go back to the old school way of making it more difficult to vote? Trump has been on the side of let's go back to making it more difficult to vote in the erroneous belief that it hurts Republicans. Many Republican leaders are arguing the opposite, that Trump's claims about mail-in ballots being hopelessly fraudulent are not supported by actual data or evidence. And I think Trump has been somewhat sort of gotten enough pushback that he's kind of conceded that, okay, do mail-in ballots, because otherwise if you don't, it hurts Republicans, and it's here to stay. Things have changed. But he just recently gave a speech where he's like, go ahead and do that, but I still think it's deeply fraudulent and highly questionable. Right? And Republican leaders are like, no, don't step on our message of trying to encourage more Republicans to vote by mail. Don't step on the lead there. Come on, man. But that's a battle within the Republican Party. All right, so next slide here. What do we want to talk about? We want to talk about voting turnout, given how central it is to our democracy, right? In general, in political science, the argument's going to be the more turnout, the better. There are some, even in the profession, who embrace what's called democratic elitism, the argument that maybe we don't want everybody voting, but that's a minority in the profession. I would say in general, if you're a political scientist, you would like to see 100% turnout. How cool would that be? It turns out, right, that's not really achievable. Historically, in recent decades, what we've seen is in a midterm election, right, where the presidency is not at stake, like 2018, 2022. In those midterm elections, you get about 40% turnout of eligible voters. And in presidential election years like 2016 and 2020, voting turnout has been historically at around 60%. Right, so those are okay numbers, right? They're not 100%. They're pretty low in a midterm. That's a little discouraging. They're decently high in a presidential year. That's mildly encouraging. But as I've said, right, with the advent of the pandemic and eased access to voting by mail and automatic sending out of ballots in some states like Nevada to those who are registered to vote, turnout has jumped. Right? For a political scientist, generally speaking, that's a positive. And it's been good for both political parties. No evidence that it has partisan bias. 2020, right, presidential year, turnout was 66%. That's very exciting for us here in political science. And even in 2018, a midterm, it was at 50%. Right, so we've seen a bit of a jump in turnout in both presidential election cycles and midterm election cycles. Very cool. I just hope we don't see backsliding going forward, but we'll see. Note the role of administrative burdens. In some states, because it turns out, right, states have a big role to play in administering elections. That goes back to the founding of the Constitution, right, and our federal system. There are some national standards, mostly laid out through either federal laws or the Constitution. But an awful lot of the details, right, are left up to the states. So access to the ballot varies quite a bit from one state to the next. That's a question that we might have, right, about elections in a democracy. I think we're one of the few, maybe the only democracy in the world that leaves so much of this up to subnational units of government, in our case, states. Feels to me like something this fundamental shouldn't vary from state to state, but it does. Administrative burdens, right? Things that sort of make it more difficult for citizens to get access to the ballot. Typically, right, justified in the name of electoral integrity. But some say, well, that's really just one side in particular trying to discourage voting by those who they consider to be undesirable, young people, people of color, those with less income, because those are the groups, right, that are more likely to be discouraged by administrative burdens. And there's a number of examples I list there. Our book lists a lot more, so look there for the details. All sorts of ways to come at that. And in a lot of red states, they've gotten very creative, coming up with new administrative burdens. And to me, as someone who's very attentive to American history, it harkens back to how suffrage was denied to black men after the collapse of Reconstruction in 1877, through things like grandfather clauses or literacy tests or poll taxes, right? Justified as legitimate administrative burdens, but really designed, right, subtextually to make it more difficult for certain groups to get access to the ballot. I hear echoes of that in today's efforts to impose more administrative burdens. History never really goes away. Note the role of race in voting turnout, and we'll look at some other demographic categories in the next slide. But here I'm going to note it because I think it's so important. Our text notes this information as well. Check that out. In 2016, as a good exemplar election, turnout among whites was at 65%, blacks 59%, right? So pretty close, but right, with a definite advantage for white Americans in terms of who votes, end of the day, de facto. Latinos at 48%, and Asian Americans at 48%, right? So quite a drop off there. Especially once you get past blacks and whites, right? Significant underparticipation by Latinos and Asian Americans. And this is looking at voting eligible population. Now note that the Latino community here and the Asian American community are disproportionately more likely to be recent immigrants, right, versus black and white Americans. And the data show that if you're a recent immigrant, you're less likely to vote. And the longer you've been here, the more likely you are to vote, right? So that's probably some of it. If we're trying to explain why Latino and Asian American participation lags between black and white participation, some of it's clearly that. And then related to that, right, because most who come over as immigrants are younger people, the Latino community in America is significantly younger than either the black or the white community. Similarly for Asian Americans, disproportionately younger than either white or black Americans. And we'll see in the next slide that age has a big impact on who votes and who doesn't, right? The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. So the fact that Latinos and Asian Americans are disproportionately young makes them less likely to vote. Those are at least two explanatory reasons why you get underparticipation by Latinos and Asian Americans. What are some other factors that influence who votes in American politics and in elections and who doesn't? Income. Income is a major determinant of who votes and who doesn't vote. This is in our text, a graph spread out, or a table spread out over 2 pages, 534 and 533. Income is a big one. I just chose a few income categories there. There's more in our book. Those making under $10,000 a year vote at a rate of 41%. Those making between 40 and 50K a year vote at the rate of 62%. Those making over 150K vote at a rate of over 80%. Over 80%. So look at that gap, right? The most affluent among us are almost exactly twice as likely to vote as the poorest among us. Right, so income has a huge impact on who votes and who doesn't. And there's something sadly ironic about that, right? Who needs, sort of the benefits that you get out of engaging in politics, i.e. access to scarce resources? Turns out the most affluent are going to get the most attention from elected officials, right? Because they're the ones most likely to vote. Who is likely to get the least out of our political system because they under-participate? The poorest among us. And so it actually reinforces pre-existing economic inequalities. Super unfortunate and dysfunctional. Education, a huge role, as you can see, quite large indeed. Those American citizens with less than a 9th grade education participate at the rate of 32%. I think these are from the 2016 election, again. 32% among those with the least education, 52% for those who have a high school degree, those with a 4-year degree, 74% turnout rate, and those with a graduate school education, 80%. So again, right, a huge gap. Those with the least education participate at a rate of 32%. Those with a graduate school education, 80%, right? About 2.5 times more likely to vote if you're highly educated versus relatively lightly educated. And you can see how these things, right, sort of combine too, right? Which groups are most likely to have the most income, right? Those with the most education. So these are self-reinforcing categories that determine who participates and who doesn't, and therefore who gets more out of our system and who gets less. It reinforces inequalities. Look at the age, the role of age there, right? The youngest among us who can vote, 18 to 24, 43% rate. 25 to 44, 57%. 45 to 64, 67%. 65 to 74, 73%. Right, so quite an age gap there. The youngest among us, 43%. The oldest among us, 73%. Huge gap in participation rates. Is that why young people don't tend to get a lot out of the system? I think that's a reason why. Is this a reason why I think we overcommit our scarce resources to the elderly? Is because they're so likely to vote? I believe that's a factor. And then finally, kind of interesting, marital status. I think I had referenced this earlier. Turns out that among Americans who are married, They vote in elections at a rate of around 69%, which is quite high. Those who've never been married participate at a rate of 49%. Now, a lot of that, right, is going to be age, isn't it? Right? Because those who are married are more likely to be older on average than those who've never been married. Okay, so that's some good stuff to know here. Demographic influences on who votes and who doesn't. All right, last slide on voting. Demographic influences on how one votes. All right, so if you decide to vote, how do demographic factors shape for whom you vote? Race and ethnicity. This will shock nobody. Whites tend to vote Republican. I believe that in the 2020 election, Trump got about 58 or 59% of the white vote. All right, so that shows you, hey, if only white people could vote, as used to be the case here in America for most of our history, Republicans and candidates like Trump would win quite regularly and quite easily. That's going to shock nobody. Blacks tend to vote heavily Democratic, heavily. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, and this is from our text, I believe blacks voted for Biden like 92%. 92% of black Americans voted for Biden. Like heavily Democratic. Yeah, so that's quite notable there. That's quite a ratio. Latinos and Asian Americans at approximately the same rates. Although Asian Americans, I think, vote a little more Democratic than Latinos, but by a pretty hefty margin. Latinos and Asian Americans vote Democratic, about 2-to-1 ratio. I think in the last election it was around 65% for Biden and 35% for Trump. Not quite 2-to-1, but in that neighborhood. So I know a lot has been made of how Trump has some appeal for Latinos, and he does. Right, but still, right, Trump lost the Latino vote by like 30 points in 2020. That's not even close. Did Cuban Americans in Florida vote for Trump? I believe they did. Tejanos in the Rio Grande Valley down in South Texas, southwestern Texas, I think. I believe so. Maybe by a narrow margin. But overall, right, you would say, Republicans have a long way to go. If they're trying to win the Latino vote in particular, as it becomes more central to our elections in states like here in Nevada, they got a lot of work to do. They have a lot of work to do. And I think it's not just about marketing either. I think, my opinion, I think at some point, as our electorate changes demographically, Republicans are just going to have to start to shift some of their policy issues. I don't see any way around it. And then related to that, right, age. Age is a massive factor in how people vote. It's a really big one. Look at those numbers, people. Look at those numbers. 18 to 29. 62% voted for Biden. 35% voted for Trump. Holy crap. That's a huge gap. That's what I mean when I say I'm not making that up. Like, Republicans really need to figure that out. Because that's the trend in terms of those entering the electorate, is to vote heavily Democratic. And let's just switch quickly to the end of that those age brackets, right? 65 to 99, 48% for Biden, 51% for Trump, right? That's the only age bracket that Trump was able to win in terms of the popular vote. Because remember, Trump lost the popular vote by a lot in 2020, by like 4.5 points. That's why these numbers look so crazy. And now Trump almost won the Electoral College, but that's different than the national popular vote. So right there, right, do you see the problem for Republicans, right? Because, and Trump also did well among those 45 to 64, all right? About 50-50, a little edge to Biden. But guess what, right? Americans who are basically, and then the more standard measure here will be 50. That's where Trump started to do well, is 50 and over. you know, among those 50 and older, right, you are much more likely to die than someone under the age of 50, right? So Trump's and the Republican supporters are literally dying and leaving the electorate, right? And who's coming into the electorate? You can see it there, 18 to 29, 30 to 44. That portends the future, absent any changes in what's happening. And changes are always just around the corner, and you just don't know the future, right? But with that being said, something's going to have to change for the Republicans to thrive going forward. It just, something has to change. I tend to think it's their party platform. But others might argue differently, of course. Yeah. So the age thing, it's a big deal. And it says something about where we're headed, absent any changes. Gender. This has become quite a gap. This is remarkable as well. Holy man. Maybe this is why marriage rates are going down in America. Look at that. Right? In 2020, women voted 57% for Biden and 42% for Trump. That's quite a gap, people. That's a huge gap. That's a huge 15 points. That's not even close. Now, Trump would say, well, screw you, man. I won the male vote by a big margin. And he did, by 8 points. That's big. Right? But men and women these days, right, especially when it comes to Trump, they vote very differently. Right? They vote very differently. And again, I'm not even really kidding here. That might help explain why we have a declining marriage rate. Because increasingly, right, it's hard to marry across that divide. That's a real thing. So that's quite intriguing. It's historically not been anything close to that. This is just stunning. That's stunning data, people. And then finally, education. And this is a shift. This is just a shift from previous years in American politics. Historically, it was if you were a college grad, you were more likely to vote Republican. And if you were not, you were more likely to vote Democratic. Well, in the age of Trump, right, that's switched. College grads voted for Biden, 55 to 43. That's a huge gap. Those without a college degree, Trump won that group narrowly, 50 to 48. Right? That's a switch. And we've talked about that a little bit, haven't we? Especially among white Americans. Trump has done really well at motivating and turning out white Americans without much education. It's been stunning because historically, that was the core of the New Deal coalition for the Democratic Party post 1932. Were lightly educated white people. They flocked to the banner of FDR, the New Deal, and the Democratic Party. That's all changed. Quite fascinating. And I think Trump helped accelerate that. Quite interesting.